Good day and welcome to this sixth in the series of videos on how we came to have the Book of Common Prayer, its creation and its transmission over the next 400 years. My name is Ross Hebb and I'm the Anglican minister at St. Peter's Church in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Welcome. Today we need to consider the 20th century, the most violent century in human history, containing 2 world wars. But as well as the 2 world wars, there was the Great Depression. And the century involved a great deal of change. It changed all the way from the late Victorian period to the 21st century. It went from a time in which aeroplanes were first invented in the early years of the century, all the way through to Apple computers and cell phones by the end of the century, a time of great technological change. But as well as technological change, there were also changes in the way people thought, the way people behaved, and the way people looked at the world around them. And this had implications for the faith and for the Book of Common Prayer. But before we get there, I want to remind us of the solemn declaration of the Anglican Church of Canada. I mentioned in the last session the American bishops at the end of the 19th century receiving their first prayer book, a revised prayer book of 1893, which they thought was a great step forward over their original book of 1789. And in the same year, in 1893, the Canadian Church met for the first time in this General Synod, and there they made this declaration: "We, the bishops, together with the delegates from the clergy and laity of the Church of England in this Dominion, now assembled in our first General Synod, hereby make the following solemn declaration." The second paragraph of which is this: "And we are determined by the help of God to hold and maintain the doctrine, sacraments, and discipline of Christ as the Lord has commanded in his holy word, and as the Church of England has received and set forth the same in the Book of Common Prayer, and administration of the sacraments and other rites and ceremonies of the Church, according to the use of the Church of England." This was the solemn declaration of 1893. But a mere 100 years later, in 1993, things were very different. In the Anglican Church of Canada, there was the Book of Alternative Services, which came out in 1985, and by 1993, it was in quite general use throughout the country, and the Book of Common Prayer was often put aside, and the new book was the one which was granted prominence. But I get ahead of myself. Generally, the 20th century falls into 2 general phases with respect to the story of the Book of Common Prayer. First, of course, there was the phase of revisions. The revisions started early on in the century. By 1918, there was a Canadian revision of the prayer book, not all that many years after the solemn declaration. Just think about that. During the turmoil of the Great War, during the time where there were hundreds of thousands of men overseas fighting for the freedom of the Western world, there were people at home revising the prayer book. And in 1919, 1918, and 19, that revision came about. One of the striking things about that revision is that they tinkered with the marriage service, particularly the purposes for marriage, and they rearranged them in a new order different than the 1662 prayer book. And this began a whole century of dealing with matters of marriage, who can marry, who can remarry, issues of sexuality and of gender identity, which were to preoccupy not just the Canadian Church, but the Anglican Communion throughout the 20th century. Following the Canadian revision in 1918-1919 was an American revision of 1928. Notice the change of pace. The Americans had waited 100 years for their first revision, and then it was a mere 20-some or 30 years before they did another revision in 1928. And then also in the same year, in 1928, there was a revision of the prayer book in England. The revision which didn't quite become official. It was passed in the end through the British Parliament, except the second edition was held up in the House of Parliament, the Commons. But nonetheless, there was a new English prayer book revision, the 1928 book. So the century began with revisions of the prayer book in many places to make it suit the day. But then there come the Second World War and the post-World War period. In the 1950s in North America, the church appeared to be booming. New church buildings were built and there was prosperity most everywhere. But things changed quite soon after that. In 1960s there was a crisis. Sex and drugs and rock and roll became the call of the day. And more importantly and more seriously, all authority and all the old things, the moralities and the ways of looking at the world, all the old verities were thought to be dated, they needed to be moved beyond, they needed to be discarded, and all the old assurances were gone, and this included confidence in the prayer book as well. And not only was there the sense that these things had to be moved beyond, there was also a sense that these older things were the cause of the present malaise, the cause of why people were not going to church. The old was the cause of the contemporary, and the old had to be put aside. But more seriously, I would argue, at the same time when all these changes were going on in society in the 1960s, I would argue that the church lost confidence in all sorts of things. The church lost confidence in herself, the church lost confidence also in her mission, and the church lost confidence also in the very reason for its existence, its message. And so the church decided that we would get rid of the old and bring in the new. And in the early 1970s we began absolute smorgasbord of new rites and new liturgies, which in the end ended up with the Book of Alternative Services in Canada, the Alternative Services Book, of course, in Great Britain, and of course the American Prayer Book of 1976. All changes which were significant departures from the traditional Book of Common Prayer. They were not new prayer books, they were something alternate to the prayer book, as the very name says. Alternate not just in services, but alternate in theology, in confidence of the message, and in presentation of the gospel. They were something new entirely. But this, of course, raises a question. What happened to what Bishop Medley said in the 19th century? Was it not still the case that the prayer book was scriptural? Well, looking back now after 30 plus years, yes, the prayer book is still scriptural. Was the prayer book not still Catholic, as it had been in the 19th century and for centuries before? Well, I think you could make the argument very strongly that yes, it was still Catholic. Was the prayer book not still comprehensive? And of course, it was still comprehensive. Was it not varied? And indeed, it was varied still. Was the prayer book not still full and frequent in its offices of prayers? And of course, it was as well. If a man be sober, rational, and Christian in his designs and his wish for worship. And so while all those things still held true, what was the change? One of the changes was that the emphasis became on not what is true and what makes for good worship in the sense of what had constituted worship down through the previous 2,000 years, but the question became, what is going to work? And by work, what was meant, what's going to put bums in pews? And so there was this great search to find a presentation of worship which would attract people. And I would argue that that was a major mistake. It reduced the eternal gospel to the level of another product in a marketplace, and it was in a marketplace in which the church could not effectively compete, because there are many things that are more attractive, at least superficially, than Sunday morning worship. It is an approach to presenting the faith which I would argue is permanently doomed, because of course there are always going to be things more superficially more attractive. There's a hockey game on the Sunday morning perhaps to attend. There's the fancy computer to try out, and there's the internet to search, and there's all those interesting pictures and movies and music on the internet, on Facebook and on Reddit to follow. And so we're going to present worship in a book as being more attractive than those things, I would argue that we are permanently doomed to failure. But all is not lost by any means. I think enough time has transpired that we can now look back at the Book of Common Prayer from a better perspective, from a fuller perspective, from a perspective of some time, of distance, and of mindset. And it is time to reevaluate what is in the prayer book. Not to throw out the new liturgies at all, but to reevaluate the value and the good that is to be found in the Book of Common Prayer, and dare I even say the relevance that can be found there. Because it does indeed still retain a great richness. It still is our spiritual legacy. It still contains scripture and doctrine and worship and devotion, which has stood the test of time for 4 centuries, and I would argue can still persist on into the future. Remember, we must, the enthusiasm of the American bishops after working with a new and rather radical new prayer book for 100 years, their enthusiasm to return closer to the classic 1662 English edition of the prayer book. Remember also Bishop Medley's famous words as to the vast wealth that is found within the prayer book. I suggest it is time for us not to throw out the new services, but to reevaluate the treasure that we have, to dust off an old gem, and to re-examine it with new eyes, a new perspective, to see the good, the true, and the beautiful which is contained therein. That, I think, is the way forward. That is a way of progress. That is a way to incorporate what is both new and what is old, and to move forward as a church into the future. Thank you, and God bless. Just before I close, I want to say a word about sources. The best general source for an overall history of the English Church and the Anglican Church down through 400 centuries is a book called A History of the Church of England by a man called J.R.H. Moorman, M-O-O-R-M-A-N. A History of the Church of England. It's been reprinted as and available online. If you're interested in the history of the church in the 18th and 19th centuries, you might actually try Hebb's book. Self-promotion here. 2 Bishops, 2 Churches. Samuel Seabury and Charles Inglis. 2 Bishops, 2 Churches, explaining the origins of the church in the United States and in Canada, and saying a great deal about their behavior at the first 3 Lambeth conferences. Also, there is a series of commentaries on the Bible readings found in the prayer book called Common Prayer, put out by St. Peter's Publications, no relation to my St. Peter's Church, St. Peter's Publications in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. And it is 6 volumes of commentary on the daily Bible readings in the prayer book. And then finally, there is this wonderful series called Discovering the Book of Common Prayer. Discovering the Book of Common Prayer, put out by the Anglican Book Centre Publishing in Toronto, and it's written by Sue Careless, a 4-volume series on understanding the prayer book in its contemporary context. I would recommend those as all new books on the Book of Common Prayer and its particular and unique history. Thank you, and good day.